reached the conclusion that we couldn't be silent about Israeli policies. We couldn't be silent about a people, the Palestinian people, fighting for their independence. And most of all, we couldn't be silent about American policy because, make no misunderstanding about it, no matter how many times Secretary Christopher pretends that he's even-handed, no matter how many times President Clinton tells us that he's trying to bring peace and democracy and freedom to the Middle East, the reality is that the United States and Israel work very closely together. The reality is that the United States and Israel work very closely with the most repressive regimes in the region. The reality is that the United States is not for a moment interested in democracy in the Middle East. It's interested in control of the Middle East. And make no mistake about it that the United States is not interested in statehood and independence for the Palestinian people. It's interested in working closely with Israel to control the Palestinian people and to create a situation which can be said to be peace, but in reality is very far from it. But since I'm the first speaker and you're a captive audience, so to speak, for a few moments, I'd like to reflect not just on the last week or two, but in fact on the 10 years of the peace process, or even the 15 or 20 years of the peace process, because many of you may not remember that this really goes back to Camp David in 1978. This really goes back to in place since.
But nervous.
Let me just reflect on that world for 3 or 4 moments and remind you of some things you may have forgotten, because peace is not what is happening in the Middle East. Right after the Camp David agreement in 78, there was one of the first major Israeli invasions of Lebanon, tremendous destruction, thousands of people were killed. Shortly thereafter, there was the Iranian Revolution. There was the Iran-Iraq War, which was something the United States and Israel pushed at the time, pushing Iraq to attack Iran because Iran had just had a revolution which needed to be weakened or reversed. By 82, you had another Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Sabra and Shatila are etched into history as unprecedented massacres. The United States intervened militarily. Our forces were blown up by Hezbollah bombers. In fact, this is the origins of Hezbollah. And the United States military left. The CIA and others stayed. By the mid-80s, you were beginning to have revolutionary Islamic movements. Today, you've had a revolution in Algeria, which has been suppressed by the military, a revolution in Sudan, a recent Islamic takeover in Afghanistan, the sanctions against Libya, the U.S. Over 1 million Iraqis have been killed, half of them military, half of them civilian. Even the UN has issued a report that over 567,000 Iraqi children have died as a direct result of American economic and military policies in the region. Not to mention the tension in Egypt, so that even the president of Egypt, who works very closely with the United States, was unable to come to this summit for fear of public backlash in his own country. Revolution in Bahrain, in which they want us to use terms like peace process, but in all honesty, I can't do that. I've been to Palestine, as I mentioned, probably 100 times since I was a student like you at a number of universities here in this country. The situation for Palestinians today in 1996 is immensely worse than it was before the Oslo quote-unquote peace process began. And the reason for that is not all that complicated. It's not all that convoluted. The reality is that in the wake of the Gulf War in 1991, there was tremendous upheaval in the Arab world. The Americans and the Israelis felt something had to be done to give the impression that peace was something that was being pursued. Hence, the Madrid conference, hence the various other conferences. But the reality, let's not go back through the diplomatic history. That's the one thing the traditional press does tell us about. The reality is that the Palestinian people are being subjected to a Middle Eastern apartheid at the very time when apartheid in South Africa has been brought at least to a structural end. The reality is that the Palestinian people are being deprived of their patrimony, being corralled onto the equivalent of reservations as we speak, with American support, with American money, with American political cover, with American veto of UN resolutions, with American arms and CIA involvement. At the moment, Israeli tanks are dug in outside of all of the self-ruled Palestinian enclaves. At the moment, you cannot even move from one enclave to another. The reality is that only 1%, I know many of you haven't heard this before, only 1% of the land that was occupied in 1967 is fully ruled autonomously by the so-called Palestinian Authority. And even that is totally surrounded by the Israelis. The reality is that this is what the West Bank has become. And what the Palestinians got, and all that they will ever get under the current formulations for real, as opposed to what you will be told, not even the white part. The blue part is totally Israeli. That's where most of the settlements are. The Palestinians have essentially signed it away at Oslo. And as Edward Said has pointed out, nobody in the Palestinian delegation even understood what they were signing. The white part is the area of joint administration. The only real part that is autonomous, but it's autonomous like Indian reservations are autonomous, as long as they stay there and do what they're told and don't violate the so-called agreements. Little pinpricks of land, the population centers of Nablus, of Jericho, maybe of Hebron in the future, Ramallah. This is the reason for the violence. This is the reason for Hamas. This is the reason for terrorism. Because the reality is that instead of peace, we've brought the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I say the Israelis and the Palestinians because it's governments that do these things. There are many good Israelis. There are many good Palestinians. Here in the United States, the Jewish community is terribly fractured. I'm sure there are Jewish people here that don't agree with what I'm saying. And yet, the organization that I represent has Jewish professors at over 175 universities all around the country. And some of the biggest names in legal affairs, Professor Charles Black at Columbia and Yale, Noam Chomsky from Harvard. We're all polarized, and we're all kept, in a sense, from understanding the realities of the situation. I'd like to close, in fact, with an Israeli poem written by the equivalent of the Johnny Carson of Israel, Dan Almagor, a friend of mine. He wrote this in the middle of the Intifada, and I think it applies even more today than it applied then. By the way, he was no longer master of ceremonies on Israeli TV after he wrote this poem, and he no longer was allowed to appear in public. In fact, his family was threatened, his house was bombed, and he was told by Rabin, his friend, that he should leave the country for his own welfare. This is a man who was at the heart of the Israeli establishment. It's not too long a poem, and if you'll indulge me, because it's so important and because it's more relevant today than it was in 1978 when he got up at a peace rally in Israel without telling anyone. He'd never told anyone that he'd wrote it. He'd never told anyone that he was going to read it. And in fact, he'd never been to the occupied territories until a few months ago when he went for the first time. He was so shocked, he called Rabin and he asked him, what in the world are we doing to these people? Rabin took him back with a few generals and tried to convince him that the policies made sense. Nevertheless, he wrote this poem. We shoot children too, don't we? Most of these people truly desire to harvest their olive trees as they have for hundreds of years. Most of these people truly desire to raise their kids, not to throw stones or Molotov cocktails, but to study in peace, to play in peace, and raise a flag, their own flag, and facing that flag to cry as we did that night, then, excited as we were. And we have no right in the world to rob them of this desire, this flag, these tears, which always come after all the others. Let us start preparing our defense. We will need it soon enough. Those who actually did it, and those who still do, and those who rushed it up, and those who still do, and those who said nothing, and those who cut their tongue saying, something must be done really, but not tonight. I have a concert, a gala event, a birthday to go to. Indeed, we will all get our summons one day for the colonel's trials. The colonel's trials are coming. Their time will come. It must be so. The trials of the generals, the colonels, and the division, the battalion, the platoon commanders. There is no escaping it. This is how history works. What shall we say then? What will the colonels, the captains, the corporals say? What will they say of those terrible beatings, the brutality, of houses blown up, and most of all, the humiliation, that humiliation of patients forced to wipe off the writing on the walls, of old men forced to take down a flag from an electric pole who got electrocuted or fell and broke their legs, of the old water carrier whom soldiers ordered off his donkey and rode on his back just for fun. We turn a deaf ear, we turn a deaf heart, mean, arrogant, and dumb. Who do we think we are to be so deaf, so dumb? Ignoring the obvious, they are as human as we are, at least as we used to be only 41 years ago. No less diligent, no less smart, as sensitive as full of hope. They love their wives and children as we do, no less. And our children now shoot theirs with lead, plastic bullets, and gas. The Palestinian state will come to pass, it will. Not a poet wrote this, history will. And seasons will come and seasons will go, and life goes on, as we very well know. Weddings and birth and death, all the same. But just the shame of it, the shame. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Palestinian Union organizations and all the co-sponsor organizations for inviting me to speak to you today. I don't know if all of you have heard the news today, but the so-called peace negotiations ended a few hours earlier, and they've made progress. According to President Clinton, the progress that they've made is to continue negotiating, and this is basically wasn't the reason, or at least it wasn't the reason we were told they were coming here for. We hoped that they would finalize a few things, and I'm going to run and talk about a couple of issues that are very important to the Palestinian people, and especially important to the Ramallah Federation. A little bit about the Ramallah Federation, since most of you are not familiar with it. It's not a political organization, it's a social and cultural organization. It's based in Detroit, Michigan, and the Ramallah people who've immigrated from the West Bank city of Ramallah, which is about approximately 15 miles northeast of Jerusalem, number about 30,000 in this country, and they're spread out all over. In 1954, we started an organization called the American Federation of Ramallah Palestine. And in 1978, we began to be more politically involved in the Palestinian cause. I represent the Federation in Washington, D.C., and basically the main task is to represent the Federation in all official government meetings that involve the Palestinian cause as well as any other Arab cause. Now, turning more to the issue at hand, the opening up of the tunnel and why the riots. The tunnel itself actually wasn't the primary cause of the demonstrations that we saw in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It was the failure of the Netanyahu government to implement all of what they have signed their name to. Of course, Netanyahu did not sign anything, but the previous government signed documents in the name of the Israeli people. To continue having credibility, the state of Israel must adhere and implement everything that they have put their name into. They must honor all agreements, whether it's with the Palestinians or any other country. The agreement to evacuate the city of Hebron is 6 months behind schedule. The agreement to keep their borders open to Palestinian workers has been closed for the last year and a half. And I think that's the most important part, and this is the one I'm going to touch on briefly. The closure of the borders. Most Palestinians living in refugee camps in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank who work in Israel depend on their daily lives to feed their families with these jobs. There are no jobs on the West Bank. As you know, during the 28 years of occupation, the West Bank was controlled, its economy was controlled, and its future was controlled by the Israeli government. They basically destroyed the infrastructure or any economic base that the Palestinians had. They depended on Israel to build, to basically harvest their crops and other means of survival. The Palestinian workers, numbering anywhere from 60 to 70,000, used to work in Israel and get paid on a daily basis. So if a Palestinian didn't get a chance to go to Israel and work that day, there was no food on the table. Now imagine this has been going on for almost a year and a half. No food on the table for almost a year and a half. What is a man to do when he walks into the house and does not have a loaf of bread or water to feed his family? What is he going to say to his children? And I think this is basically one of the main reasons that the Palestinians revolted. They revolted with the Intifada in the 80s and 90s. For 8 years, they stood in front of M16 rifles, knowing that there's a very good chance that they'll be killed if they threw that rock, and they did it anyway. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, many maimed and injured. And we saw last week as well, thousands of Palestinians standing in front of Israeli soldiers, standing in front of jeeps, throwing rocks, knowing damn well that they will be killed if they threw that rock. But the reason they did it is because they have pride in their country. They want to live free, and they want a Palestinian state living in a democratic society. They no longer will accept apartheid. The South Africans have done away with apartheid. This is the only region in the world that we see people being suppressed as we see in Israel. This is the only situation that I can think of where people still go hungry at night and do not have enough to feed their families. The other part of the equation is the failure of Israel to implement its peace treaty. Hebron, again, is one example. But the tunnel, a lot of people say it's not really significant, but it is significant. Let me just touch on one base of the tunnel. Now, the tunnel is very important to the Israelis. It gives them more sovereignty over Jerusalem. It extends their borders into the Muslim quarters of Jerusalem. Israel has, in the last 10 years, have creeped slowly into the Christian quarters, as we saw in 1992 when they occupied a Christian hospice belonging to the Greek Orthodox Church. They basically took it over, they removed the cross from the building and put the Star of David there. And they still occupy it until today. They are trying to widen the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem by taking land and buildings away from Christians. And now, as we see, they're trying to do it again by taking land, whether it's above ground or underground, away from the Muslims. The desecration of religious lights must not stand. And the Palestinian people, proud people at that, will not stand for that. I think Yasser Arafat made a big mistake coming here. I think Mr. Mubarak said it well. I don't trust this man. And I think after today, I don't think anybody else will trust this man, because basically he came here with no clear agenda to give anything whatsoever. His statement is, I'm not going to reward violence. That's fine. You don't have to reward violence. But you have a responsibility to your people, to the Israeli people. And as my learned friend said, there are good Israeli people. And there are plenty of good Israelis. As we saw in the rallies, thousands of people coming out against this government. We're not against the Israelis, we're not against the Jewish state, but we do want to live with peace. We want to have our dignity in our country as well, and we have every right to do that. The illegal use of American weapons by the Israelis, again, is in contradiction to American law. We saw Cobra and Apache helicopters attacking from the air in the city of Ramallah and in the Gaza Strip, killing innocent civilians. And this is one issue raised at the White House meeting last week, that this is in contradiction with American law. It is illegal for Israel to use weapons offensively against the civilian population. They are in fact in violation of American law. And the law basically states that in any country that violates the use of military weapons all aid will be suspended to that country. They have violated it 3 times in the past 15 years, and not once has the American government made an issue out of it. And this probably would lead us to the reasons that were discussed by my friend earlier, that the Americans and the Israelis basically are doing anything that they want to do in order to suppress the people, because this is basically, it comes down to it, it's about the security of the United States in the region. But somehow I feel that the Palestinians gained a little bit of pride for a couple of months when they saw their troops moving into the cities. We saw people raising the Palestinian flags all over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They felt some pride, but this pride has been tarnished, and tarnished by the new Israeli elections. I was very optimistic about the situation, and I've always been a very moderate person. And I believe that unless the state of Israel, and I am talking about the people of Israel, not the government, because I too don't trust Netanyahu or his government. The history of his cabinet, with Sharon being given credit for the massacre of Palestinians in Sabra of Shatila, again as a cabinet member. David Levy, again, during the Intifada years, we saw the way he treated the Palestinians. But I believe that there is a possibility of bringing peace to the area, but that peace must come at a price of Israeli evacuating the West Bank, evacuating the Gaza Strip, and giving the Palestinians the right to self-determination and a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. Unless something happens in the next month or so, the negotiations, which will start on Sunday, unless something happens with these negotiations, I think we will see more bloodshed, and bloodshed this time, I don't think Arafat or Netanyahu can stop it. It will mean thousands of lives on the Palestinian side. It will also mean thousands of lives on the Israeli side. The Israelis lost 14 soldiers. That number might not be high, but during the years of the Intifada, they didn't lose 14 soldiers for 6 or 8 months. And this time they lost 14 soldiers in 2 days. Those are high numbers. And I think unless something is done quickly, unless they come to their senses, unless the United States is serious about the peace process, I think we will see another war in the Middle East, and this time it will be very catastrophic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hanania, for sharing with us the situation of the Palestinians under Israeli occupation and all that they have suffered. Before we continue, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be having a question and answer session at the end when all of our panelists have spoken. So we urge everyone to please stay, and if you do have any questions, please prepare them while the panelists are speaking them and have them ready. Our next speaker is Shakir El-Sayed, the president of the American Egyptian Council, a Washington-based community and political organization. He is also a representative from the Muslim community and considered an Islamic scholar. Mr. El-Sayed.